Simon Peter is my favourite disciple. I just think there's something so very human about him, so that in spite of living 2,000 years after him, I sort of feel that if I were to meet him, he'd somehow be recognisable in our modern world. The Gospels and letters in the New Testament show us that he's impulsive and he speaks when he shouldn't. He's so fiery that he does things that Jesus has to subsequently put right. He's a family man who takes his wife on his mission trips. He's loyal and he's loving. He's spiritually insightful and he's brave. But he's sometimes frightened and regretful and flawed. And he's a man of action. He's a one-time fisherman working through sleepless nights and busy days. So I'm sure that any inactivity in this period after the resurrection must have been pretty difficult for him. So perhaps it's no wonder that once he's back home in Galilee, he goes out to fish. And his mates say they're in too because he's that sort of a guy. He's the trustworthy type. He's a natural leader and people follow him. But as we know, there's no catch all night. And then his friend John recognises the figure on the beach. Peter doesn't need telling twice. It's the Lord. So off he goes, doesn't stop to think. He just grabs his coat for the sake of decency and he's in the water. What's going through his mind as he splashes like an awkward duck through the shallows? I wonder, is he remembering his calling to be a fisher of people, perhaps reminded by that great catch of fish of just how many souls Jesus wants him to win? Or perhaps he suddenly remembers that previous time when he'd left the safety of the boat behind to walk on the water to Jesus without really thinking through the consequences. Must have seemed like a good idea. But then he had realised how exposed he was to the wind and the storms, and he'd taken his eyes off Jesus, so that he had begun to sink, and he'd had to be rescued. Well, back to the present, and his friends are still bringing in the boat with all the fish, but Peter is already there on the beach, and he's looking Jesus in the eye, with their shared history between them. He's got to stop acting impulsively, and he's now got to face up to what he did when he had denied knowing Jesus just hours before the crucifixion. Perhaps it's a relief when he has to get back into the boat to help his friends to finish the job that he'd left too soon, as he's still just as vulnerable as he was when the wind and the waves had threatened to overwhelm him. I suspect that many of us can identify with him. Perhaps, up until this point, we've been busy rushing around, perhaps for years before this crisis started. But now this inactivity has forced us to stop and think. Our priorities have changed amazingly quickly, so that in some ways we are rediscovering the things our grandparents thought were important, like the availability or lack of it of self-raising flour, and the need to walk to the shops instead of driving there, so that all of a sudden we can't take those ordinary things for granted. But even more than this, social distancing has perhaps forced us to look around and see the muddles at home, or the weeds in the garden, or the mess we've made of our careers, or our own deep-seated loneliness. We're uncomfortable because silence and solitude drag up the memories and regrets we have buried, and all our fears and failings are clamouring for attention. Because suddenly it's time to deal with the things that are weighing on us, and it's time to talk to God about them. And if we don't, he might just make us face them anyway, just like he's about to do with Peter. who for a little while at least is going to be squirming and hurt. But there's love and redemption at the heart of what Jesus does next. And Peter is going to come through stronger, even if he does still have a long way to go.
So many words have been written over the years about Jesus' threefold question to Peter over this breakfast meal. Do you love me? Do you love me? Do you love me? And about the significance or otherwise of the change of language in the text from agape love to phileo love, which is used in all of Peter's answers for the third question. At that point, Peter becomes upset. But commentators today tend to agree that we cannot know for certain whether any significance can be attached to this subtle distinction between the different words for love that are used in John's Gospel, because in the rest of his Gospel, these two words are used completely interchangeably. Instead, what I find significant here is the number of times Jesus asks Peter, "Do you love me?" Remember, just a couple of weeks earlier at the Last Supper, Peter had defiantly insisted to Jesus that even if I all fall away on account of you, I never will. To which Jesus replied, "Truly I tell you, this very night, before the cock crows, you will disown me 3 times. Sure enough, just a few hours later, when challenged by people who recognized him as one of Jesus' friends, Peter responded, "I don't know what you're talking about. I don't know the man." And finally, with curses and swearing, "I don't know the man." At which point the cock crowed. And we're told that Peter remembered Jesus' words and went outside and wept bitterly. Although John's text offers no explanation for Peter's hurt feelings when Jesus asks him for a third time, "Do you love me?" it doesn't take too much imagination to suspect that the third question might have brought the guilt of his denials, still pretty near his emotional surface, right out into the open as he remembered the pain and tears of his failure. If that is what is happening, then it's not because Jesus was having a go at him. Rather, John's Gospel records Peter's very personal conversation with his risen Lord during this time of relative inactivity between Easter and Pentecost as a conversation of forgiveness and restoration and commissioning, one that would take Peter from the sort of self-centered self-interest of a brash individual willing to promise what he could not deliver, to the sort of self-sacrificial love that would model his life on Jesus, and which ultimately would even follow the model of Jesus' death on a cross, as Jesus predicted how he would die. Early church tradition tells us that Peter was crucified upside down because he didn't feel himself good enough to be crucified the same way up as his Lord. Despite that rather daunting warning, this was a healing encounter for Peter, as Jesus commissioned him to feed my lambs, to take care of my sheep, and to feed my sheep. In other words, to provide spiritual nourishment and pastoral care for all believers, including new Christians. Despite his failings, Jesus entrusted Peter with a most significant role in the life of the early church. Above all, Jesus' command to Peter was simply a twice stated, "Follow me." Don't worry about what I might or might not have planned for others, like John. Just be faithful to who I've called you to be and what I've called you to do. And so barely a month later, Peter was leading the church's first evangelistic outreach mission at Pentecost, which saw Christianity go viral as it grew from a church of 100 or so to over 3,000 in the space of a day. Could he really have done that if he was still hampered by the unresolved memory of denying Jesus? If he was still in any doubt about his commitment and love for Jesus? Or for that matter, if he was in any doubt about Jesus' commitment and love for him? This breakfast encounter at the lakeside was the pivotal moment of healing that restored Peter as a committed and faithful follower of Jesus, freed from his past mistakes to follow the path and purpose that Jesus was laying out for him. Freed, in other words, to be who God intended him to be. Peter's sense of hurt at Jesus' third question, "Do you love me?" reminds me that healing sometimes hurts. We sometimes say, "No pain, no gain," don't we? Think of the sorts of exercises that physios seem to love to give us to help us recover lost strength after illness or injury. Or in another example, I'm reminded of the time over 25 years ago after Pauline and I suffered one of the biggest losses of our life, when we were singing the hymn "I Cannot Tell" one Sunday at church, and when neither of us could get through the line, "But this I know, he heals the broken-hearted," without breaking down there and then in front of everyone. We were surrounded by such love and compassion from our church at Sunningdale that day that moment of deep hurt coming to the surface became, in God's hands, a moment of deep healing. In this time of relative inactivity that we're facing, I wonder, what past hurts or failures does Jesus want to heal in us today? What might he ask us? Perhaps more than once, if it drives the point home. What might he ask us? And what does he want to ask us to do for him that takes us, like Peter, from the point of self-centered failure to the point of willing and self-sacrificial following?
In a couple of minutes we will sing or perhaps listen to a song that we first heard last week, which reminds us that even in the middle of all our hurts and failings, Jesus will hold us fast. But first, as we reflect on how God might want to work in our lives today, Jenny is going to share a poem that she found which seems to be very appropriate for our current circumstances.